Okay, everybody, welcome back for another episode of Philosophy Friday. We are continuing on with our extended discussion, the definitive discussion, as we promised, on the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas. Are these successful philosophical arguments for the existence of God, and how best to interpret them? So let me quickly reintroduce my wonderful guests. I am joined once again by Dr. Gavin Kerr and Carlo Broussard. So I guess we could do introductions again, but if you're watching this part and you haven't seen the first one, it's not going to make any sense anyways. So maybe we should just skip the dull preliminaries. If you have no idea who we are or what we're talking about, just go back last week and just catch up and just hit pause right now. It's just not going to make sense. But anyway, these dudes are super cool, very smart. It's always an honor to have them here on the podcast, and I'm really looking forward to where this conversation goes. So before we dive in, would you guys have you had any further thoughts on everything that we covered last week? What were your general impressions? I'd love to just go around and hear a little bit on that.
Carlo and I had a really cool discussion last night just on this whole notion of the accidentality of essay and how that can lead into, certain issues and certain problems. And it brings out different fissures amongst Thomists, depending on where you go with it. So we had a really cool discussion on that, if you want to hear about it.
Yeah, is this something that would be best to introduce now going forward, or should we bring it up as we get to one of the specific
Well,
ways?
what we talked about applies directly to what we were talking about last week concerning the first and the second way. Because essentially we were talking about how to defend the causal principle. That if a being does not have esse or existence of itself, then according to the Thomistic causal principle, it must receive that esse from the extrinsic cause outside of itself. And so we're talking about how best to defend that. And so I had asked Gavin about the issue. We kind of touched on this in part 1 of our discussion about what he thought about the accidentality of esse. And what are sort of the guardrails, I guess, right, Gavin? If we assert the accidentality of esse, where's the boundaries of the playground in playing with the accidentality of esse before we go overboard into some other ideas that might be outside the boundaries of classical Thomism?
Okay, this is cool. So real quick, just to, if people are, even if you've listened to the first conversation, you might not know exactly what we're talking about. Accidentality, esse, what are these things? And we had a question come in, Gavin, anyways, which is relevant to this, where somebody wanted you to really try to explain what Thomas's view of esse is. Like, what does Thomas really mean when he says esse? So, I mean, we could keep backing this conversation up and up and up. So at some point we just got to pick a launch point and go forward. So maybe that's it. Then we can get into what you guys are talking about and move forward from there.
Yeah, probably. So if I speak to that issue just on what Thomas means by essay, that could lead us nicely into what I was chatting with Carlo last night, because it would probably be best to say what essay is not, because that's what came out with the discussion with Carlo, and where I sort of situate myself into with regard to John Canasis's existential Thomism, and take it from there as to what I take to be Aquinas' account of essay. How's that sound?
That sounds perfect. Let's do it.
Okay, so
go read Gavin's book.
And a ton of other books as well. So,
right.
So there's an account of essay. So essay, the act of existence, okay, which the essence has. There's an account of essay which sees essay as an accident of essence insofar as it's distinct from essence. So it's something that happens to the essence of the thing. Now, in sort of mid-20th century Thomism, there was this view of essence called the thick essence view. And the idea here is that essence has enough reality to it that essay can be added to it to make it real. But essence isn't quite real, it doesn't quite exist, but it still has enough something of reality to it that it just needs to be topped up with essay, and essay has to be added to it. That's the Latin Avicenna position, more or less. on essay. I say Latin Avicenna because it's the Avicenna that Aquinas knew and read in Latin. It may not be the historical Avicenna, though I think one can make a good case for it being the historical Avicenna.
Sure.
So the idea here is that essence has reality in three ways. In the real substance, in the intellect, and in itself. Okay, so there are the three modes of being that essence has. In the actual substance, so the essence of a tree is in the tree, it's its treeness. It's in our intellect and the way that we think about it, the idea of its treeness. But essence also has a reality in and of itself, independent from existence in the intellect and existence in the thing. So there's this realm of essences. And what God does, think about it as this realm of essences as possible worlds. What God does then, he chooses these essences and he gives existence to them. So they have a certain reality and he gives existence to it. Now, that view of the distinction between essence and existence, Aquinas rejects. But it gained a lot of traction in the 13th century after Aquinas' death. And a thinker just immediately working after Aquinas' death, who was actually tasked by the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tempier, to put together the list of condemned propositions, some of which included propositions from Aquinas, Henry of Ghent. He devised this terminology of esse essentiae and esse existentiae. So the esse of the essence, so the essential being that the essence has in itself, and the existential being which the essence receives, esse existentiae. And this is what the distinction amounts to, according to Henry of Ghent, and that seems to be a repetition of the Avicennian view. One can also find a form of this view in Alexius Meinong, the German philosopher in 19th century, who made a distinction between objects which merely have what's called Bestand. They simply subsist, but they don't exist. And then the objects that have Bestand, they're topped up with existence. They're made real with existence. So there's more objects having Bestand than objects which have existence. And so it's that idea that possible beings have reality to them, and the reality just needs to be added to in a certain way to make them real.
Right. So just to maybe clarify, and for people who are new to this type of conversation, so you could imagine that, take tree, for example, a tree, right? So there are trees, right? These have been actualized. They're out there in reality. And there's something that makes it possible for us to talk about trees, treeness, right? The essence of trees, treeness, whatever that is. And the position you just outlined says that this essence is real in the trees, in the concrete individual trees. It's real when we abstract it in our minds. But perhaps even more fundamentally than that, we can imagine as sort of the ultimate grounding explanation of where these essences, both originate and find a source of unity, is as a sort of plurality in the mind of God, right? As templates, more or less, we might say, of possible beings, and then from this template of possible beings, he decides to actualize all of them, or some of them, or maybe even none of them. Obviously, he's actualized some.
Well, slightly more than that, even independent of God's mind, these essences have some reality in themselves.
Okay, all right. So I missed that.
So Gavin, would it be fair to say that it's closely related to like third realm of Platonic forms, similar to that?
It would be like Platonic forms, only they wouldn't have that fundamental actuality the Platonic forms have. They're more they're more just potentiality, but not pure potency.
Okay, so it's not pure nothingness, right?
Yeah,
it's not. So it would be somewhere in between. It seems like it would be somewhere in between cognitional being, right? So like the essence as known by the mind. So right, as I know the idea of tree, or the universal form of tree, it's not nothing, right? The form is in my mind, and it also exists as an exemplar in the mind of God, right? In the divine intellect. So this view seems to be positing some sort of reality that's between cognitional being and being outside of the mind, real being. Outside, right there, here and now.
I think that's what it is. And so the view developed that when existence is added to essence, it's added to that essence, which has some reality in itself. And that was coined in 20th century Thomism, mid 20th century Thomism, as the thick essences view. You can see why it's called the thick essences view. They have a thickness, some solidity to them, which just needs to kind of have existence added to it to make them real.
To just thicken it up a little bit, right?
Yeah. Cornelio Fabro, in his book, Participatione Causality, really attacks this, and he roots it in Latin Avicennianism and Henry of Ghent, and he sees it as a misreading of Thomism, because it makes the act of existence nothing more than a thin veneer, which is just added on to the thick essence just to solidify it and make it real. So it's not actually Thomistic essay. It's not the act of all acts. That leads us into what Thomas, so the question was, what does Thomas think essay is? Essay is the act of all acts. Nothing would have reality were it not for essay. So essence doesn't have any reality in itself unless it has essay. Now, that could be the essay in the mind of God, in our minds, or in the actually existing thing. But there's no third realm of essence in which essences kind of float about, awaiting just to have essay injected into them to make them real. So essay is the fundamental principle of all reality, without which there is nothing. Everything comes from essay, and God is pure essay itself. And then every individual has its own individual act of existence, because that act of existence is what makes that individual and no other individual real. The essences, now, I mean, I kind of deal with this in the book on creation. Okay, so where does God get the essences from by means of which he creates things? I point out that to think about creation like that is wrong, because God doesn't create in the way that you would make a cake, where you get the different ingredients and then you put it all together and then you have a creature. So he doesn't get a bit of essence and a bit of essay and just put them together and bang, you have a creature. Rather, God creates the creature directly. And in creating the creature directly, essence, essay, matter, form, all its metaphysical components are co-created in the creature. And as co-created, they stand in certain relations of act and potency to each other. And the most fundamental principle of actuality then within the creature is essay.
Mm-hmm. But we can still, would it be true to say that we can still assert that given the distinction in a finite being between its essence and its essay, that we can say that essay is quote unquote accidental in the sense that it does not belong to the thing as such, in that it doesn't have essay in virtue of itself. So whatever does not belong to
its essence,
in virtue of its essence, because it has it in virtue of itself in that it's a subsistent being, right? It doesn't inhere in something else outside of itself, like an Aristotelian accident does.
Yeah. So it has it in itself, but not through itself.
Right.
So
it's per aliud.
Essay, but it's not through me that I have my essay.
Right. So we could affirm that it's accidental in that sense, right?
Yeah.
But not accidental in the sense of the Latin Avicennian view.
Yeah. And so my sort of quarrel, well, it's not a quarrel, but my disagreement with John Canassis is that his reading of Aquinas's take on essence, absolutely considered, seems to render essence like that Latin Avicennian view, a third realm kind of essence. And in the recent edition of the Annals of Philosophy, when Canassis put forward his position, I kind of responded that, well, this sounds like the Latin Avicennian view, which Thomas rejected. But, so that's kind of just where that disagreement between the two of his lives. And there's a total disagreement, so I'm not talking down on Canassis there, I'm being respectful to him.
Right. Yeah. Hey, no, that's what philosophy is all about, right? We love arguments. They're compliments. All right.
Yeah.
Now, okay. Now let's connect this to everything we talked about in the last episode, if we can. What's the line there? Mm-hmm.
So, well, Carlo, this was your thing.
Well, I was trying to run the argument. And by the way, Gavin, I looked up that article that you directed me to by Joseph Owens on the causal principle or conclusion ?
Yeah.
And what was it? The Modern Schoolman, I think that was the journal.
Yeah. It's been about 10 years since I read that.
Yeah, I actually read it, and it's interesting. He doesn't see it as a first principle. I was amazed by that. He sees it as a demonstration to demonstrate that if SA doesn't belong to something in virtue of its essence, then it must receive that SA from an extrinsic cause. And he zeroes in on the accidentality of SA. Now, of course, he makes all the qualifications, right? The essay is not an accident in that it inheres in the subject, right? Because of the priority of the essay. And he emphasizes the note of dependency in accidentality.
Yeah, so that's what we were talking about,
That's right. So if essay is accidental, with all of the qualifications we need to make, right? If accidental, then essentially dependent.
Yeah.
It can't be dependent upon the subject it's actuating because of its priority.
Yeah.
And it can't be nothing, because if nothing, then you have essay that's dependent and independent at the same time in the same respect.
Essay which is dependent with nothing on which to depend.
That's right. That's right. And so therefore, essay, when it's distinct from essence in a creature, must be dependent upon some subject outside of the subject is actuating.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's Joseph Owen's conclusion. I must admit, I mean, that's how I read Canassus when he was defending the principle of sufficient reason, understood in the Thomistic, through the Thomistic lens, right? Okay. That it opens up a can of worms when you use that terminology for Thomas, right?
Yeah.
But that seems to be the view that Canassus was taking, right? In trying to defend the Thomistic causal principle, emphasizing the accidentality of essay, which necessarily includes the note of dependency, and then running the argument based upon that. And what was interesting, Owens in that article, he makes the claim, he puts a stake in the ground and says, this is the only way that we can defend it. And he says, even before you look at the limitation of the essay, and even before you look at the relationship of potency and actuality, because when you look at the relationship of potency and actuality, it just pushes the problem back to another arena, right? It's just like sweeping the dust under the rug, because you still have to give an account of why the potency cannot be actualized simply as a brute fact, right? Why there must be something actual to actualize that potency and make the potency different than what it is. So it was an awesome read. So for all our listeners out there and viewers, just type in Joseph Owens, The Causal Principle or Conclusion, a great short paper that you can read in a fairly short amount of time. Right. Get some good stuff.
So real quick then, just to remind people what we talked about last time, I think there's two potential upshots of this weedy conversation we're having right now. And that is the sort of hunt that you've been on, Carlo, of trying to draw out a contradiction from the brute fact skeptic, right?
And I've been looking for it, and I found it. I've just been trying to understand it. It was in Lagrange articulates it in his 2-volume set, God, His Nature and His Existence, Volume 1. When Lagrange is trying to defend the principle of sufficient reason, he argues that an uncaused contingent being, what does that mean? A being such that its essence and essay are distinct without an extrinsic cause for its essay, right? Such a being leads to a contradiction. That's what he argues. And I think what's working in the background of that argument, of what he's trying to argue, is the idea of focusing on essay itself that's distinct from a creature's essence, and trying to draw out the implications of that essay being uncaused, right?
Correct. Right. And this will also have implications to something Gavin and I talked about maybe 2 conversations ago. I forget exactly when it was. That's kind of come back up again, of existential inertia. So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that in connection to this point now, or if we should just move forward.
Well, so, I mean, I think everything pretty much that we said in that other conversation is, being repeated here with regard to essay and essence and dependence for essay, such that essay isn't a principle of the thing which subsists in a subject. Essay is the principle without which there would be no subject, Whereas inertia and inertial properties, if one holds that existential inertia is a property which inheres in something, that's the strong view, then SA is not like that because it doesn't inhere in anything. If one takes the weak view of existential inertia, which is just the view that objects have a tendency to remain in existence, not in virtue of any sort of property inhering in them, such as existential inertia, but they just tend to remain in existence, all that really is describing is the continued existence of things. It's not giving an account of how things remain in existence. So there has to be appeal to some sort of metaphysical principles there, and we're back to essence and essay again. So either any way you cut it, there will be the dependency of essence on essay in order to be at any point at which the essence exists. And what accounts for that dependency? Well, it can't just be a brute fact, as we've been discussing, precisely because if it were a brute fact, you would have dependent essay with nothing on which to depend. So there has to be some sort of extrinsic cause for the
Whether
essay.
you're talking about the beginning of the conjoining of essay and essence, or the actualization of the potential of the essence, or right here and right now, as the essence and the essay are continuously conjoined, or stated differently, as the essay is actualizing the essence, making it real.
Right. Because with regard to the actualization of the essence by the essay, there is no distinction between beginning, middle, and end. It's just, actualizing. That's all it does. There's no beginning point where it actualizes a little bit and then more and more, and that develops.
So it's not like a one-time actualization, right? And then it's all or nothing. Floats on. Right. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very, very cool. Hey, welcome to the Pat Flynn Show, guys.
What an introduction, right?
No, I love it. I mean, this is great stuff. And
hey, I will say, Pat, that a few of my pals out there who are philosophy nerds and love to geek out with this stuff, they watch the episodes and they're loving it, man. So
yeah. Good.
Kudos to you and Gavin.
Yeah. Thanks to you guys. I got a ton of great feedback from the first episode. Gavin, I always get great feedback from all of our episodes. So I think we'll have to make these roundtables more common. I love it. Okay, so let's get back to the task at hand then. Honestly, guys, I forget where we left off. Did we get through the second way? Are we on the third way? Or?
Yeah, we had gotten through the second way, and then we left off, and hopefully we can get through the remaining three ways. We'll see.
Cool. All right. So let's dive in. Gavin, let's kick it over to you.
So the third way. So what we've been seeing in the first two ways is when it comes to Aquinas' way to God, he's isolating some sort of, particular effect that's manifest in reality. So the first and most manifest is motion. The second is causality, efficient causality. And what he does is he interprets that effect in such a way that there's some sort of act potency distinction there. The effect signifies the existentially dependent status of the thing subject to the effect. And from there then he reasons in a familiar way to a primary cause without which there would be nothing at all. And that's how the ways are generally going to go. So when it comes to the third way then, the particular feature is possibility and necessity. Well, it's taken from possibility and necessity, and it's split into two parts. The first part is ordained to showing that not only possible things exist. So possible things don't exhaust all that is. There has to be at least one necessary thing. And then the second part seeks to show that when it comes to necessary things, there are things which are either caused in their necessity, or there is something which is uncaused in its necessity. That's the conclusion, and this is what God is. So a lot to tease out in that, because in contemporary terms, if we think generally when we think about something which is necessary, we think about something whose non-existence would imply a contradiction, something that exists in all possible worlds, something like that. That's not Thomas's view at all.
Yeah, and that's worth spending at least a minute on, because there's a lot of interesting work on necessary existence in contemporary philosophy. In fact, Alex Proust and Josh Rasmussen have a great book out called Necessary Existence, and a lot of good arguments arguing for at least one necessarily existing concrete thing. But then you read Aquinas, and he's talking, well, you could be necessary, but still contingent
Cause?
in a sense, right? And then you're like, well,
Yeah.
what's he talking about? So yeah, Gavin, tease that out a little bit for us. What are the appropriate distinctions we need to keep in mind?
So for Thomas, something is a possible. So a being is a possible, so possibilia. So a being is a possible being insofar as it can be generated and corrupted.
Yeah.
Something is a necessary being because it cannot be generated and cannot be corrupted. Okay.
Good.
So
Yeah.
it comes into existence through a direct act of creation, and only the creator would allow it to be would enable it to be corrupted. In other words, it goes out of existence not through any sort of natural process of corruption, but because the creator decides not to grant it an active existence anymore.
Right. So angels would be the traditional example of this, but also the human soul and.
Yeah. So there are three categories of necessary creatures in Thomas's worldview. Angels is one of them. Okay, so they don't come about as a result of any sort of natural generation. You don't have two angels copulating and bringing about, a little angel baby or anything like that. And angels won't go out of existence unless God, takes them out of existence. The human soul, the rational soul, because it's an immaterial form on Aquinas' account, is something that requires a direct act of creation and something that can only cease to be through God's willing it to cease to be. Interesting argument for the immortality of the soul there and the direct infusion of the soul. And then, interestingly, according to medieval physics, the heavenly bodies are necessary beings because this is because their form completely fulfills the potential of their matter, completely actuates the potency of their matter. So the only potency that the heavenly bodies have is potency for moving from one place in space to another place. So potency for locomotion, that's the only change they can undergo. So the heavenly bodies require a direct act of creation as well. So there are the three kinds of necessary creatures for Thomas. And what the first part of the third way seeks to show is that not all things are possible things. There are some things which are necessary. There's at least one thing which is necessary, and that could be a human soul, an angel, or a heavenly body. That's the point of the first part of the...
So Gavin, would it be fair to sort of interpret or translate that terminology with, we're starting out with things that have come into existence and go out of existence. And in the first part, we're trying to show that there is at least something that is everlasting, right? Something that has not been generated, something that cannot corrupt, having no subjective potency within its nature to corrupt. And then from there, reasoning to something that's not just everlasting, without beginning, without end, but something that's going to have that everlasting existence in virtue of its very essence, such as the absolutely necessary being.
I'm sympathetic to that reasoning. I'm uncomfortable with talk of everlastingness when it comes to the necessary creatures, because I think you could talk about the heavenly bodies as being everlasting, but I'm not sure you could talk about angels in the same way. Of course, there's this notion of sempiternity, a kind of quasi-eternity, but it seems to me that sempiternity is closer to eternity than it is to temporality. And I would tend to gloss everlastingness as remaining throughout time. And I don't think that's applicable to something like the angels, but it just depends on how you would gloss everlastingness.
Yeah, I think what I'm thinking in my mind as everlasting is just something that has not been generated and something that of its nature doesn't have a potency to corrupt.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that then, and that would be fine. I would just avoid, I would just avoid, for strategic reasons, that whole kind of language.
Yeah, if I can just, because sometimes maybe it might be helpful for people listening in, for clarity's sake, to maybe just give an objection towards a version of this argument that I think we would say is probably not the correct interpretation of this argument, right? Which is a sort of, as we commonly see with Aquinas, right? If you start to read things temporally for Aquinas, you're probably getting something wrong, right? So one of the objections would be, Okay, well, maybe, why do we need some eternally or necessarily existing thing? Like, isn't it logically possible that as one thing corrupts, it leads to another thing coming into its place, and we just have this great chain of corruptible beings, one leading to the next, right? I think I'm trying to remember right first. Was that one of Kenny's original objections?
Yeah.
Right.
But it came up before Kenny. Maybe we
Yeah.
should lay out the first stage of the argument before we get to that objection.
Yeah, let's do that. So we
Yeah.
have the broad strokes. Let's get formal with it.
So, I mean, in the first stage, he's discussing possible beings, and he says, look, it's evident that there are these possible beings because they're generated and corrupted. And he says that given that these possible beings are such that they're generated and corrupted, if all things were like that, at some point that there would be nothing in existence. This is because a possible being at some point is not. So if all things were possible beings, at some point there would just be nothing. And if at some point there were nothing, then because nothing comes from nothing, even now, there would be nothing. But there is something now, in which case not everything is a possible being, and so there has to at least be one necessary being. Now, the supposed fallacy which is found there is the idea that just because for any one possible being, it has to at some point not be, whether that's before it exists and then comes into existence or after it exists with its corruption, that doesn't mean that if all things were like that, that nothing would, that at some point there would be nothing. And this is because it's making the sort of fallacy that Bertrand Russell gave a really good example of it. Just because there is a mother for all, just because every man has a mother doesn't mean there's a mother for all men. Thomas seems to be making that fallacy that just because every possible being at some time is not, doesn't mean that there's some point of nothingness for all possible beings.
Right.
Yeah. So that's known as the quantifier shift fallacy or the fallacy of composition. Now, there are a few ways of reading that first stage of argumentation. There's a way of reading it which is drawn from Moses Maimonides. So Moses Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher, he has a similar argument in the Guide for the Perplexed. And the idea here is that given an infinite amount of time, whatever is possible will occur. Okay, given an infinite amount of time. So if you have some possible being, well, given an infinite amount of time, given that the corruption of a possible being is a possibility for it within an infinite amount of time, that possibility will actualize, and that possible being will cease to be. So that principle that at some point a possible being is not is interpreted by Maimonides in terms of the infinity of time, and any possible being then will cease to be given an infinite amount of time. I can't stress enough that is not Aquinas' reading. Okay, nowhere does a presupposition of an infinity of time come into it. And I've had several people actually contact me saying, Aquinas' third way just doesn't make sense to me because he assumes the infinity of time and then he runs the reasoning. And I don't know where people are getting this interpretation. I don't know what secondary source has put that out like that, but that's not Thomas's reasoning at all. What's distinctive about possible beings, my view, is that they come into being. That's what makes them possibilia. They come into being through generation, not through a direct act of creation as opposed to necessary beings. So it's not the corruption of possible beings which really distinguishes them. It's their coming into being through being generated. So, and by the way, Kenny, in his book, The Five Ways, holds the opposite position. He says, well, look, what's distinctive about, these possible beings is that they cease to be. Now, as memory serves me, I don't think Kenny endorses the Maimonides reading of it. I can't recall. It's been a wee while since I've read it, but I don't think he does. But I do know he does say that what's distinctive about possibilia is that they'll cease to be. But to my mind, what's distinctive is that they come into being through generation. So that idea that for a possible being at some point it is not, we're not talking about it ceasing to be after some amount of time. We're talking about the time prior to its coming into being. That a possible being such as you or me or my cat or my dog at some point in the past was not.
Mhm.
And I think this is a key hermeneutical tool for reading the first part of the 13th. You just say amen, Carlo, did you?
I did. I'm sorry, brother. I know this is a philosophy. I got to put my philosophy hat on. Sorry. I got to take my theology hat off for a second.
No,
Sorry
it's
about
good to
that.
know. It's good to know
No, because
somebody agrees with
that's
me.
such a, like you said, that's such a key hermeneutical tool. Because, Gavin, you know, one of the problems I've often had with reading it like Maimonides and looking toward the future of things ceasing to be, presupposing an infinite amount of time, that cuts against Aquinas's hypothesis to begin with.
Yeah.
If all of reality were possible beings.
Yeah.
Because if you're presupposing an infinite amount of time, then you're not going to have all of reality being possible beings, because something must be necessary to account for the infinite duration.
You have some sort of actual infinite, arguably.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you would have an infinite number of human souls or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you're right on the money in reading it as Aquinas emphasizing non-being before being.
Yeah.
With regard to the possible beings.
Yeah. Yeah. So when Aquinas reasons then that for some possible being at some point it is not, he's thinking about the time before which the possible being came into existence. So that when he reasons, if all things were like this, at some point there would be nothing in existence. Now here's the key. When he says at some point there would be nothing in existence, he's not talking about a real point in time. He's thinking about time in an imaginary way, because obviously if there were nothing in existence, there's no time. So when he talks about at some point there would be nothing, he's thinking of imaginary time. And he does this in several other cases as well in the metaphysics. What that indicates then is that he's not thinking about real temporal, physical before and after. He's thinking about the metaphysical conditions which bear upon the coming into being of possible beings. Right. So he's thinking about the metaphysical conditions which bear upon their coming into being. What are the metaphysical conditions which bear upon their coming into being? Well, at one point there were nothing, and then at another point there were something. Now, if everything were a possible being such that it's dependent for its actuality, it's dependent for its being, then at some point there would be nothing, unless, of course, we have some sort of necessary being which can account for their coming into being. So as I read the first part of the third way, then, that composition fallacy doesn't occur, precisely because we're considering the metaphysical conditions for something coming into being, something being something rather than nothing.
So even though it's not a direct parallel to some of the more contemporary contingency arguments, it is of a similar flavor, we could say. So, like my friend Josh Rasmussen, right? So the way he kind of thinks about this is in relations of dependency and independence, right? If everything and Spitzer too, right? If everything in reality were dependent on its existence, like awaiting for the fulfillment of conditions beyond itself in order to be, well, there's nothing by definition beyond that. So those conditions could never be fulfilled. And then we really are stuck with the conclusion that there would just be nothing, right? And then we have to say, and maybe we want to accept that, right? Oh, cool, right? You want to live that way, that's fine. But if we think there's something, then we are forced to conclude, well, there at least has to be at least one necessary being. Do you think, again, maybe not exact parallel, but do you think it's closer to that style of argument?
Yeah, it's a family resemblance. There is a definite family resemblance there. It's just the notions of possibility and necessity are slightly different. That's all.
Right.
So,
Gavin, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go on. I was just
I was going to ask you, what do you think about the view? I've come across this in several papers and several readings of the first part of the third way, when trying to analyze if all reality were possible beings, that at some time nothing was, and getting around the quantifier shift fallacy in reasoning in this way. Well, if we have A, B, and C, right? 3 possible beings, each of which were generated. They came into being. And our hypothesis is that this is all reality is, just possible beings. Well, A at some point came into existence. It had a beginning, right?
Yeah.
B at some point, and as we're tracing it back into the history, tracing their histories back into time,
Mhm.
you're going to come to some point such as C that
Mhm.
came into existence before which it was not.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
therefore, at some time, there was nothing. And still using time in the imaginary sense,
Mhm.
just
Yeah.
like even in the Kalam argument, you use like before which there was nothing, right? You're
Mhm.
using imaginary time.
Mhm.
So some read it as, well, if we trace these possible beings back into their history at some time, imaginarily speaking, there
Mhm.
would have been nothing, and from nothing only nothing comes. Therefore, there must be something necessary that is not coming into being, non-generable,
Mhm.
that can give existence or some sort of creation.
Mhm.
So you're bypassing the quantifier shift fallacy, right?
Mhm.
And making sense out of, if all things were possible beings, then at some time was not. And that
Mhm.
seems to be different than the metaphysical condition approach that you're articulating, which I'll admit I'd love for you to articulate a little bit more, because in my own mind, I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around that view in making sense of what Aquinas says versus the view that I just articulated. I know Father Stephen Brock reads it like that. Thomas, let's see, what was it? Thomas Kevin Conley, The Basis for the Third Way, reads it that way. So I'd like
Yeah.
your thoughts on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So the way that say Conley reads it, I'm familiar with Conley's big long article
Okay.
on it from the Thomist. He's reading it as a physical argument. So
Yeah.
he's tracing back, the A to B to C. And if
Okay.
everything is like that, at some point we get to a point, where something is coming from nothing, but nothing comes from nothing. So we have to have something necessary.
Right.
I'm reading it as a metaphysical argument insofar as what I think Thomas is up to here, when considering the notion of the temporality of possibilia, is that he's taking temporality in that imaginary sense, and he only ever does that when he's talking about the metaphysical conditions which need to be in place for any sort of temporality or temporal becoming to occur. And so for the temporal becoming of, let's say, a possible being coming into existence is not just that you have, say, matter, form, and all the rest with generation, but you have some sort of dependent for its existence or its actuality at the point at which it comes to be, and at every point of its being.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does that
So
make sense?
it comes back again to, are we reading these metaphysically or physically in some sense, which part of the I have to say I kind of like them both. Both seem to be plausible, successful readings.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So now
I know Joseph Owens, in his article on the Third Way. I think I read
Quando
that
que
recently.
analiquando?
Yeah, I think so. The one that you had
Yeah.
recommended me to read.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that and thinking that even on the reading that I articulated of looking at the temporal sense, like beginning with the temporality, but it's still being within a metaphysical framework, because you're still trying to account for the being of things coming into being from non-being, right?
Yeah.
So, and one of the questions I have with the metaphysical conditions, how is it that the starting point on that metaphysical condition reading, how is it that the starting point is not the distinction of essence and essay? Because if that's the starting point, then we have a problem with the first necessary being at the end of the first part, right? And needing to be caused. So I'm still trying to distinguish between this metaphysical condition reading and it not being, starting with the distinction of essence and essay from generation and corruption.
Yeah, dead on. So the starting point of the third way, well, the starting point of the first part of the third way is possibility and the consideration of possibility. And so on my reading of it in terms of the metaphysical conditions, whenever Thomas holds that for any possible being, at some point it is not, he's alluding to its dependent status as an existent, and so being dependent for its existence. What that then entails...
Because it came into being.
Yeah. So what that then entails is that if all things were like this, at some point there would be nothing, i.e. if there was no necessary being, these possible beings would simply be nothing because they're dependent for their existence.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah. So the necessary being the metaphysical condition for these possible beings existing here and now.
Yeah. And so he's moved to the second part of the third way because he's not finished, because he recognizes that there can be necessary beings which can be themselves dependent for their actuality, for their necessity as necessary beings. And so he has to remove what could be an objection that, well, maybe the necessary being which accounts for all these possible beings is a caused necessary being and not something which is absolutely uncaused.
Okay. Now, what distinguishes the dependency of the first necessary being at the end of the first part from the dependency of the possible beings at the beginning of the first part? Does that make sense?
Yeah. What distinguishes it is that one is necessary. It doesn't come into being and it won't go out of being. Whereas the possibilia, they come into being and they can go out of being. It's not until you get to the very end of the third way where you realize that all of these, the possibilia and the caused necessary beings, are dependent for existence. But
in the same way.
Yeah. But at this point in the third way, the only thing to distinguish the necessary being from the possibilia is that it doesn't come into being through generation and it's not corrupted.
Right. Okay.
So that's the only way that's distinguished. Is that okay?
Yeah. One of my professors actually articulated this idea, which I found fascinating. I'm still trying to see if it maps on to how the third way is presented versus chapter 2, I think, book 2, chapter 15 of the Summa Contra Gentiles, right?
Book
Where
1, chapter 15.
Is it 115?
Yeah.
It's not book 2. He doesn't have one in book 2 either. I'm gonna have to go back and check. Where he says possible to be, not to be, therefore necessary, can have an infinite necessary beings. Okay. So the idea is moving from something that can be separated from itself, from its existence naturally, to something which cannot be separated from its existence naturally, namely the first necessary being at the end of the first part. And then reasoning to something that cannot be separated from its existence, absolutely speaking, namely an absolutely necessary being.
Yeah. I'm sympathetic to that reading, and I think that's what's going on in the third way. What I think Thomas is doing is that he's adopting a starting point and then impossibility, and then using that starting point to try to run that reasoning. He uses a different starting point in the Contra Gentiles, book 1. He just immediately begins with the metaphysical conditions possible to be and not to be, and then necessary being, but cause necessary being, and then absolutely uncaused necessary being. It's the same argument being run, but it's just being arrived at through different starting points.
Right. So let me throw this a little bit different of a question for you, Gavin, and Carlo. Would like your thoughts on this too. We're not finished with the argument yet, but let's say we finish up with it and we agree. Yeah, this is good, right? Is there an upshot to this though, compared to some of the more contemporary contingency style arguments that are out there? Like, what's the upshot of taking Aquinas's specific path? You see what I'm saying?
I suppose I should say, full disclosure, I think this is the weakest argument from Aquinas.
Which is fine. Like, hey, everybody's got to have a weakest, right? But a weakest can still be good, right?
I mean, when Aquinas is at his weakest, it's like Eddie Hall or Haffel or Bjornson, at their weakest, still stronger than most. I think the upshot here is that the sort of argument being articulated in the third way is rooted in, a robust metaphysics, which I think is unmatched in anything in contemporary philosophy. So, full disclosure.
Certainly, I agree with that. Yeah.
So that would be the upshot. You've got to, if you're prone to these sorts of arguments which employ these modal notions like possibility and necessity, and you want to see them embedded within a robust metaphysical framework, well, I think Aquinas gives you that.
And I'll give an example of that, right? So sometimes in I'm thinking back to Necessary Existence, which I think again is a great book, but my friend Josh, we'll get him on one of these conversations. He'd be a good guy to jam with too. he talks about modal continuity with respect to limits, right? To metaphysical limits, that there's no relevant difference when it comes to metaphysical limits with explanation. So he kind of rides that through to an infinite being. But the question always kind of lingers if you don't have the deeper metaphysics of why do limits require an explanation, right? I think you can keep pushing it. So I think that's the upshot ultimately, right? Is we can give the deeper metaphysical basis to support modal continuity, right?
And that's the sort of stuff that Carlo and I were talking about earlier with regard to brute facts. The same sort of reasoning that comes in with regard to limits, because we avoid brute facts when we can establish the limited and dependent status of the received actuality, in this case essay. So
right.
And I think limitation comes in big with the fourth way. That might be actually a good segue into the fourth way, because where you find things of more and less, you have the principle of limitation. And my reasoning is that if limitation, let's say limitation of essay, limitation of being, which would account for more and less, right? If limited, then the essay is going to be quote unquote accidental with all of the qualifications we had earlier. The essence of the thing is going to be distinct from its essay if you're finding essay in a more perfect way in one being rather than another. So that limitation to me is revelatory of the accidentality of the essay. And then we can run the argument for the causal principle: if accidental, then dependent; if dependent, not dependent upon the subject it's actualizing, but upon something outside of itself.
Right.
So the limitation, i.e. the limitation and also the gradation, right, is a revelatory of the essay being distinct from the essence.
And I think the same thing is being run at the start of the third way, because I think possibility is revelatory of the limited and dependent status on essay for anything which is possible.
Yeah, see, I'm glad you said that, Gavin, because this is where I keep getting hung up on reading the third way in light of the metaphysical conditions, okay? So if the possible beings, right, the fact that it's generated and corrupted, I get the fact that that's revelatory, that its essay is distinct from its essence, right? Corruptibility, generability, obviously it doesn't have essay in virtue of its essence. But if that's what's going on in the third way, then the first necessary being that accounts for that is going to have to be something different than that datum. And so thus you end up with the first necessary being something such that its essence is identical to essay. And then, of course, it's unintelligible to ask what caused it.
But Thomas doesn't say at the end of that first part that this necessary being accounts for those possible beings. What he's saying is that not everything can be possibilia, because if they were, they would be nothing unless there were some necessary being. He hasn't said yet that the necessary being that we arrive at accounts for all those possibilia. All he's saying is that possibilia don't exhaust everything that is.
Okay, so that's an interesting insight. I'll say this, that I haven't considered that idea that what Aquinas is saying is just, okay, not everything can be possible, and then reasoning that, well, there might be some sort of necessary being such that its essence is distinct from essay. I don't know. I lost my train of thought there. I'm going to have to think about that one a little bit. So the first necessary being not necessarily accounting for the datum that we started with.
Exactly. Yeah. The point is just simply that not everything could be possible, because if everything were possible, there would be nothing. So there has to be something other than possibilia, and that's necessary. But he doesn't say at that point that the necessary being accounts for the possibilia, just that there has to be something other than the possible beings which exists.
Okay. All right.
Now, ultimately, he is going to say that there is a necessary being which accounts for the possibilia and the necessary beings as well. Because the third way isn't taken from possibility to necessity, it's taken from possibility and necessity.
Yeah. See, on my reading of it, I was reading, starting with the temporal sense, getting to that time in the past, the first thing before which there would be nothing. Consequently, there would have to be something that's non-generable that can account for things coming into existence, and then asking, well, what does such a thing have essence and virtue, essay in virtue of its essence or not? If so, then we got God. If not, then we're on to the reasoning.
Yeah, see, I don't think that's what's happening in the first part of the third way. And I actually think that sort of reading leads to a kind of Avicennian emanationist view of how God and creatures relate to each other, because the idea seems to be you have possibilia, which depend on caused necessary things, which ultimately depend on the uncaused necessary. So the uncaused necessary emanates the cause necessary, which in turn emanate the possibilia. And that's contrary to Aquinas' whole way of thinking. So I don't think it's a straightforward possibilia, cause necessary, and uncaused necessary. I think what he's doing in the first part is simply showing that possibilia don't exhaust everything that exists. There has to be something other than possibilia, which is something necessary. And then he goes on to, then the second stage deals with, well, what's the causality involved here?
Okay, so why not, to push back a little bit, and as some authors do in the literature, why not just? It seems as if your datum, if your starting point is possible beings, such that their essence and essay are distinct, right? And so if everything such as that exists, you don't have essay, right? Why not just arrive at that which accounts for the datum being something such that its essence and essay are identical? Some would say the first necessary being at the end of the first part is superfluous.
Don't you just wish you could just call up Aquinas real quick?
I think the reason there is because if we did that, so the third way is taken from possibility and necessity. If we did that, then we wouldn't have accounted for those cause necessary things. We wouldn't have kind of fitted them into the whole causal framework. All we would have done is shown that there's some primary being, and this primary being is called to account for the existence of all these possibilia. Now, obviously one could infer, well, if it causes the existence of all those, it must cause the existence of cause necessary things as well. But Aquinas wants to show that, cause necessary, he wants to be explicit that cause necessary things are dependent on this primary cause of necessity.
Okay. We'll have to go back to the drawing board, Pat.
Yeah. Well, hey, that's what these conversations are for. But again, we wanted to make this the definitive one. So, okay, what are some of my thoughts on this then? I mean, this is a kind of inter-Thomistic debate, right? At this point. And it's kind of partly different than the idea of, is this a good argument? It's, well, what did Aquinas really intend here? Which is certainly interesting. I have to say I've been always far less interested in that question than I have of just what are the best arguments, right? What are the best versions? I've become increasingly interested in what is the best interpretation of what is most faithful to Aquinas. I have become increasingly interested in that, but yeah. And since discussing with Gavin, I've found a synthesis with the 5 ways that I've not seen before when reading many other Thomists that I admire and respect. So I've become very attracted to these existentialist interpretations, because you read some of these other people on the 5 ways. I won't mention any names till we get them here to defend themselves, right? But they kind of seem scattershot, right? They don't really seem connected. And that always kind of struck me a little bit. It's like, wow, it's like really that radically. And like, sure, like I get people like to have collections of arguments, right? That's good to have. But Aquinas just seemed like much more of a systematic thinker than that. He seemed like somebody who probably wouldn't be now, Carlo, I'm not saying that the way you're reading it would count as a scattershot. There's other ways that I've seen it presented that just seem very, very kind of out of left field almost, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, my only trouble right now, currently where I'm at in my thinking, is like I'm sympathetic to Gavin's reading of the 3rd way with the metaphysical conditions, because I think it's spot on in looking at non-being before being, right? The things coming into existence, and I see that coherence and that mapping on to what Aquinas is saying in the text. I'm just struggling to see the metaphysical condition reading mapping on, just like point for point and mapping on to what the text is saying versus the other reading. But like I said, with some more time and thinking through it, I think I'll be able to come to that final conclusion. But I do agree with you, Patrick, that it is a beautiful thing of reading the five ways. You know, Dennis Bonet, retired Thomist philosopher from New York, he has a book that he wrote on the five ways. And it was interesting, his take, in showing how each of the five ways provide us starting points to see SA as distinct from essence. And then you're off to with the de ante reasoning, right? So five sort of entry points.
Right.
Seeing SA as distinct from essence. And then reading all five of them with that same hermeneutic of the de ante, as I know, Gavin, you're sympathetic to, and Canazas, argues for very strongly in reading the five ways with an existentialist approach, although the existentialists will read it in different, variety of ways as well. But just that whole framework of reading the five ways with a particular hermeneutic, right, through a particular lens, and seeing them unified. Not that you need one to complement and perfect the other, because I think in my reading that they all stand alone. Yes, they're connected, but I do think they all stand alone because all of the divine attributes are embedded in the conclusion that you can unpack, right? But at the same time, in reading it with the existentialist approach and through that lens, you do see a harmony between the five ways. And it seems to me that that's the way to articulate the harmony of the five ways, as opposed to trying to show that they kind of rely on each other.
Right. No, that's beautifully said. Gavin, any further thoughts on that? And then what else do we need to say about the third way? So we got to get on to 4 and 5 here at some point. This will be this will be an ongoing series, which, hey, I'm totally cool with. But
yeah, I suppose just in discussing with Carlo there, we've really put our finger on a point of interpretation of the first part of the third way, because as I read it, when Thomas arrives at that point where he says there has to be at least one necessary being, he's not saying that necessary being is accounting for the reality of all those possibilia. He's just making the point that possibilia can't be the only things that exist. There has to be something other than possibilia that exists. That's the point he's making. He's not making any causal claim yet.
Yeah, that's key right there.
And I think that's a key part of the reading and interpretation of the third way that I would give. And so, I mean, I think it just, puts a finger on that that needs to be clear, because the whole issue of causality and where the causal relations lie, they don't come up into the second part of the third way. That's when we get into causality and, how possibilia are caused.
Cool. Yeah. So let's do it. Let's go there.
So we'll really, when we get to the second part of the third way, we spot reasoning, which is very familiar if you followed the first two ways, and it's really just this per se ordered series reasoning. And the idea here is that you have necessary beings, and they're either caused in their necessity or they're uncaused in their necessity. If they're caused in their necessity, well, that sets up a causal regress, which per the first and second way can't be infinite, and so we arrive at some per se, i.e. uncaused cause of necessity for the necessity of all else, and this we call God. And there's an awful lot in that, I think, which is overlooked, because when you think about what a caused necessary being is for Aquinas, it's not something to which God has given some sort of special trait, such as existing in all possible worlds or something like that. He hasn't given it something special. Rather, what he has done when he brings about a necessary being is he brings about a necessary being of a certain, he brings about a being of a certain kind. But he does the same thing when he brings about a possible being. He brings about a being of a certain kind. So God's bringing about necessary beings. He doesn't have to do anything extra or anything special, anything more than he does when he brings about possible beings. He's rather bringing about a being of a certain kind. And how does he do that? Well, it's the same for the necessary as it is for the possible. He grants existence to them. So when we arrive at an uncaused source of the necessity for necessary beings, we're arriving at an uncaused source for beings of a certain type. But if we have an uncaused source for the existence of beings of a certain type, that applies to possible beings just as much as it applies to necessary beings, in which case we're talking about a cause for the existence of such things.
Right.
So that uncaused source of necessity is actually a cause of existence for all things.
Groovy. And this obviously is going to build on what we talked about last conversation. So again, if you missed all the talk about per se, causal series, act potency, we're not repeating that again. Especially with Gavin, we've had him on so many times, especially with the de ente of going through this. So the homework and onus is on the listener now at this point.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, Carlo and Gavin, any other like tidying up bits about this argument or?
Yeah, I was just going to say, for Aquinas to ask, well, what caused the first necessary being at the end of the first way? The only way that can be intelligible within Aquinas's metaphysical framework is viewing such a necessary being as something other than a being such that its essence is identical to its essay, right?
Yeah.
So to ask the question, such a necessary being is such that its essence is distinct from its essay. And in Aquinas's framework, that would be, as Gavin stated at the beginning in articulating the argument, would be the human soul, would be angels, or the celestial spheres, celestial spheres. And that's a hang up for many people. I remember somebody asking, how can a necessary being be caused? Because they're immediately equating necessary being with an absolute necessary being into mystic terminology, right?
Yeah, just different. This is so important to make sure you take Aquinas on the way he used those terms,
right?
Not how contemporary philosophers use those terms. Do we want to unpack, because we unpacked, some of the divine attributes a little bit when we got to pure actuality at the end of the first way. Do we want to spend any time doing that at this conclusion of this argument, or we want to hold off on that for a little bit more?
Well, I mean, there's several different things, to kind of tease out with the notion of something which is absolutely necessary. Unpacking that, you might need a whole show on that one, especially this issue. Well, if it's absolutely necessary, how free is it to create?
Right. Yeah.
Is it necessitated to create? Aquinas obviously says no. Avicenna thinks, well, it must create. Given that something which is absolutely necessary causes not just necessary creatures, but also possibilia as well, that indicates that its creation isn't just an overflow of its existence into things. It's not an emanation, rather it's the direct creation of everything, which is in turn a willed creation.
Right. Yeah. We'll save modal collapse for another conversation. We can hold off on that one for now. Okay. Cool. Shall we dive right into the fourth way then?
Fourth way, yeah.
Yeah, gentlemen, I'm going to let you kick this one off because I've been sitting here drinking a lot of tea, so I'm going to take a 2-minute bathroom break. But I'll catch up. You guys keep going.
All right. So fourth way, I should say. I mean, full disclosure: the third way is my least favorite of the ways. The fourth way is one of my most favorite. One of my favorite. Precisely because I think it draws out Aquinas's Platonism. I think at heart Aquinas is a Neoplatonist through and through. He's a Neoplatonist with an Aristotelian terminology, and I think the fourth way really draws this out. Should we just kind of go through it then and just see how we go?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So like the third way, the fourth way, it's divided into two parts. There's two stages for it. The first stage, you could call it the Maxima stage. It's a stage sort of setting out to show that there is something which is maximal in being, and then the second stage seeks to show that which is maximal in being is the cause for the being of all other things. So just like in the first way, or just like in the first part of the third way, we have a certain preamble stage which gets some sort of important conclusion that Thomas wants, and then the second part of it deploys notions of causality to show that there is some sort of primary cause for all things. So the way in which Thomas goes about things in the fourth way is that he begins by saying, look, there are all these different sort of perfections that things have, and they have them to a greater or lesser extent. So just off the top of my head, goodness, what is it? It's goodness, nobility, and what's the other one? Truth.
Yeah, gradation to be found in things. There's some more, some less, good, true, noble, and the like.
Good, true, noble, and the like. Yeah, yeah. So that's Aquinas then reasons that given the those different gradations, with regard to each one of those attributes, you can only have the more and the less. You can only have gradations in good, truth, nobility, and the like, if they approximate to something that is maximal and not respect. That's the only way that you can have those gradations. And it follows then that insofar as things which are gradated, good, true, noble, and the like, are gradated because they approximate to something maximal, there's something maximal in being, then there's some sort of maximal being towards which things are gradated. Okay, so that's the first stage. Shall we give it a wee bit of an unpack?
I was just going to say, when I first read the fourth way, I think like most people, I'm like, what on earth is this guy talking about, right? And then I don't know if you said this, Gavin, but you said this is your favorite, or is it
one of my favorite? Yeah.
What are your favorites? So
probably this or the second way is probably my favorite.
So it'll be cool to hear if people's impression of this changes, as mine has after talking to more of the professional Thomists. Carlo, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, I think the key principle, Gavin, that I would love to give your thoughts on, that we need to defend, is why is it the case that the more and the less implies the maximum? Now, one thought comes to mind immediately, that I would assume, it seems as if Aquinas wants to assert that it is necessary that such a maximal being exists based upon the observation of more and less. Like the more and the less the more and the less is revelatory that there is a maximum, right? Would you agree with that that he's looking for a metaphysical demonstration at the end of the first part, or is he doing some sort of something other than a metaphysical demonstration, just allowing the mind to ascend to something that's maximum based upon the more and the less?
Yeah, I think there's a demonstration going on here in the first part. I think causality, act, and potency is involved here, or is being revealed here.
And is working in the background, right? Yeah. That the more or the less is going to approximate the maximum, because the more and the less indicates a feature that needs to be caused, which is reasoned back to a being such that has the feature in virtue of its essence.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly what's going on in this first part. Will we dive into that then?
Yeah. Let's unpack it. Let's roll.
So we have these perfections, good, true, and noble. Some people think that this first part is discussing the transcendentals. So famous doctrine of the transcendentals. The transcendentals really are just these features of being, which are coincident with being. They're found everywhere that being is found, and they reveal something about being not already revealed by the term being itself. So anywhere being is found, goodness is found. Anywhere being is found, unity is found, truth, and the like. The only thing here is that Aquinas employs the term nobility. He says we have good, true, noble, and the like. And nobility isn't in any of the lists of the transcendentals, and it's hard to see how it could be a transcendental. So for those who read this as referring to the transcendentals, they have quite an easy time seeing how the first part of this way leads to that conclusion that there's something maximal in being. Because if we're thinking about the transcendentals and gradations in goodness, truth, and whatever as pointing towards something maximal, well, because goodness and truth are convertible with being, they're coincident with being, and they reveal something about being, then whatever is maximal in goodness and truth and whatever must be maximal in being. So the transcendental reading is very straightforward, but I think it's wrong, precisely because he uses this notion of nobility. And I think this is a key notion, and it's something that Gary Gould-Lagrange alerted me to in that book of his, God, his essence and his nature, isn't that it? Yeah, that's the English.
Yeah, God is existence and nature, or something like that. Yeah, I can't remember the exact title.
Yeah. Something that Lagrange alerted me to, and I also, in reading John Whipple, was led along this line as well, is that when you look at how Aquinas uses the term nobility, indeed, when you think about Aquinas' notion of perfection, but when you look at how he uses the term nobility, and you can do an index Thomisticum search to see his use of the term nobility in his works, he often is using it to refer to actuality or perfection. That's how he's using it. He's using it to refer to the actuality of a thing. So what he's actually saying there in the first part of the fourth way is that you have things which are more or less in actuality. And that's a key interpretive or hermeneutical principle for the fourth way, that there are things which are more or less in actuality. They have degrees of actuality, but they don't have the fullness of actuality. So things are more or less in actuality. And the point is that if they don't have the fullness of actuality, well, they don't have actuality per se. They have it through another. They're dependent for their actuality. So degrees, gradations in goodness, truth, nobility reveals degrees in actuality, and thus dependence for actuality. But if we have dependence for actuality, well, that's what we've been seeing is going on in the first way, the second way, and the third way.
Right.
Each of those is beginning with some sort of feature of the world and then disclosing to us dependence for actuality.
Right.
So if we have something which is through another, it's reducible to what is per se, which is that which is maximal of being.
So this is cool because it brings us back to a kind of contemporary parallel that I brought up. This is we could argue this is really an argument from limits in some ways, or a family resemblance, right? That if something is bounded or limited or qualitatively finite. Okay, so that if that is the right interpretation, we then let's spend some time unpacking that. Why is it the case that limits, finitude, restrictedness entails that there really is a real distinction here between essence and existence? That this thing is it's contingent, it's dependent, it's caused. What's the metaphysics going on here? Yeah.
So if you have something which is dependent for its actuality, it has to be dependent for its esse, for its existence, because nothing which is pure existence, okay, which is not dependent for its existence, which is pure existence itself, is dependent for its actuality. That which is pure existence, that whose essence is its existence, is purely actual. There's nothing outside of it on which to depend. So anything then which is dependent for its actuality can't be that, in which case it's be dependent for its existence.
Sorry,
okay, so
somebody
let's
froze up there. Sorry,
yeah.
I don't know.
So let's back up a little bit and try to tease out why is it that the degrees, having something to a degree, thus in a limited way, indicates that the actuality is dependent.
Right. Yeah. So
in other words, that the actuality is not had in virtue of its essence, and thus doesn't have it per se.
Yeah. So what's the relation between restrictedness and dependence? Yeah.
Yeah. So if something has actuality in a limited way, then it's not pure actuality. And if it's not pure actuality, there's something independent of it on which it depends for its actuality.
Okay. What do you think about this reasoning, Gavin and Pat? I'd love to get y'all thoughts on this. That which belongs to something in virtue of its essence cannot be had more or less. And here's the example. I have I am a rational animal, like my essence, right? Rationality. I have rationality in virtue of my essence. That belongs to what I am. We cannot speak of Carlo having more rationality than Pat, and Gavin having more rationality than Carlo. Why? Because if that were the case, then I would be less of a human than Gavin, and Pat would be less of human than me, right?
Yeah.
But since that's not the case, because we're all human equally, we're all equal with regard to our humanity, it cannot be the case that which belongs to be in virtue of my essence be had more or less than another.
Yeah.
So whenever you find something that is more or less than another, some feature, it follows that such a feature is not had in virtue of the thing's essence. Yeah. And so consequently, that thing, if it's not had in virtue of its essence, then there's a distinction between the essence and that feature. And
Right.
given that goodness, and this is where I kind of like the transcendental reading of the goodness being convertible with being, right? And truth being convertible with being, finding those in more or less indicates that the essay of the thing, of the plant and me, is not had in virtue of our essences, right? So I have more, quote unquote, more being, looking at essay, looking at more being in virtual quantity, right? With regard to perfections. So I have a higher level of perfections according to my mode of existence than the rose or the plant in the garden. And I can even conceive of a being that has higher levels of perfection, thus a higher mode of existence than me, such as an intelligence that's pure form, not composed with matter, right? Not going through discursive reasoning. So that indicates that my essay is had of a limited nature. It's in degrees. And if degrees, then I do not have it in virtue of my own essence. And therefore you have the quote unquote accidentality of essay.
Right.
And thus we begin running the causal principle.
And yeah, and I think
causal principle.
For me, that's the kind of critical thing we have to draw out in the fourth way. I think, right now, I think we can get it from other demonstrations. So if we can first show that, there can only be one thing that exists in virtue of what it is, and it's going to follow that anything else just isn't that thing. But then we're just kind of launching from a different argument, right? And we don't want to cross streams, as they say in Ghostbusters. We want to see if this argument can go through on its own.
Right.
So I think that's the thing we have to do from this argument in and of itself, is from this starting point, start to argue, why does finitude, restriction, boundaries imply that this thing does not have actuality in and of itself? Right.
And the reason why the more and the less implies the existence of a maximum is based upon the causal reasoning, that if more or less, then you don't have the feature in virtue of its essence, and thus you need a cause, and then you're off to the regress, finding a cause that has the feature of itself in virtue of its own essence, which would have it to the maximum degree. Yeah. So if we look at goodness, of a cause having goodness in virtue of its own essence and thus convertible with essay, there could be nothing greater than that thing, right? Because it would be maximal essay, unlimited, unrestricted essay, no degree higher than it. And that would be the source of the essay or the goodness or the truth of those things that have these features more or less.
It sounds plausible enough. The only difference I would have is, and it's probably just a strategic one, is that the way I would run it would be to move from goodness, truth, nobility to actuality, and then from actuality to essay. So I wouldn't go straight from goodness, truth, and nobility to essay, and so to a per se source of essay. I would need to have the idea that these disclose the actuality of the thing, and thus discloses the essay of the thing. But that would just be a strategic reading. Everything else sounds fine.
So then, Gavin, your path is to specifically go from nobility to actuality, right?
Yeah.
And
well,
then,
that what those three sort of perfections represent is actuality.
just all three of them, represent actuality, right?
And you
then
can take any one of them. Yeah.
And then you go from the sort of finitude of actuality to the real distinction, and then you're off, right?
Yeah,
Is that a right fair view?
Exactly. So precisely because actuality is had to a greater or lesser degree in the thing, that signifies finitude and thus signifies dependency, and so we're led in, from the that paralleled nature, which dependency reveals, to the per se source, which is pure actuality itself.
Right. Yeah. Now the whole, finitude is the one that I've always been interested in. Finitude, restrictedness, and I've always been attracted. And I don't know if this could be worked into this as a plausible interpretation or not, but Spitzer and his work on ontological simplicity, right? And the idea that boundaries exclude, and that in order that to ground the reality of anything else that exists, we're going to have to get something that's free of all boundaries, right? Otherwise we're going to have a contradiction of impossible possible states of affairs by the exclusion of the boundaries. And I find that quite attractive and very forceful. But could that be worked in as a plausible interpretation of the fourth way? I don't know. I haven't really thought about it.
That sounds like Thomas's notion of participation, that you have some sort of participant which ultimately relies on an unparticipated source.
Mm-hmm.
So you have something which exists through participation, depending on something which exists per se. What you described there does sound like that participation metaphysics.
Right. So yeah, it's abstract, but once you get the idea of like metaphysical boundaries, you understand the sort of, I guess, ontological underpinnings of the principle of contradiction, right? That have the boundaries of an electron excludes the boundaries of a proton. To have the boundaries of a square excludes the boundaries of a circle. That's why we can't have square circles or anything like that. So yeah, to have any collection of finite things, like whatever the fundamental reality is, it can't be an electron, right? Because then protons would be impossible, right?
Yeah.
So then we'd have to say that this possible reality, which are protons, would actually be impossible. And we do get a contradiction from that. We'd have impossible possible realities if we posit finitude or restriction on the most fundamental reality. And Spitzer's line, and it's not just Spitzer's line, of course, he's drawing from many great traditions, is like, we have to get rid of limits. We have to get rid of boundaries. We have to get rid of restrictions in order to avoid these contradictions, that whatever else this fundamental reality is, and this, of course, lends to an argument for divine simplicity, right? Like divine simplicity has to be true. There can be no real metaphysical boundaries, either in the interior or exterior, right? Or else we're going to have these contradictions. Now that might just be an entirely separate argument. I like that argument a lot. It's one that I think is quite forceful, but I don't know if it's something that can be plausibly infused or fairly interpreted as being in the fourth way.
Yeah, based upon my memory of working with Father Spitzer, I remember going through his argumentation there and arriving at, a purely simple being, an unconditioned reality that wouldn't be bounded in any way in order to be compatible to all possible beings, right? To ground any possible being to come into existence. And I think that maps on in a different way, but it does map on to the fourth way, because the second part of the fourth way, Aquinas says, this maximal being that is pure actuality, pure essay, that's going to have the goodness, the truth, and the nobility, that perfection and virtue of its essence to the maximum degree, is not bounded in any way, and consequently can be and is the cause of all that is in the quote unquote genus, right? All that has the feature that the maximal being has of itself, or in virtue of its essence.
Yeah. What do you think of all that, Gavin?
Which part?
Just all that truckload of gibberish that I just dropped on. No, yeah, I guess it does. It does fit nicely with Aquinas's participation metaphysics. I absolutely think so, and we know Spitzer is a Thomist. We got to get him. We got to get him on one of these conversations. Yeah.
Well, I mean, two observations to make there. Generally, when you move from conditioned to unconditioned reality, that really is just, a move from participated to unparticipated being. It's a very Platonic sort of move. That's the first observation to make. The second observation to make, that physicists, in my experience, tend to be Platonists anyway, and so tend to be at home with that those sort of Platonic moves from participation to unparticipated source. So it seems to me that it can map on to the fourth way. It would just take somebody to sit down with Spitzer's work to do that. It could be a doctoral thesis in that.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to bring on put on the table here, Gavin and Pat, for our listeners out there, one thing that may be helpful to understand the principle of how the more and the less implies the maximum, and to read that principle in light of efficient causality, right, would be Aquinas's example that he uses in his sermons on the Creed, I think it is, where he talks about being in the house. You enter into the house and you feel heat more and less. So as you enter the house, it's hot, but as you go further into the house, it becomes hotter. And then you eventually get to that which is hottest, not hottest in an absolute sense within reality, that than which there can be nothing greater hotter, right? Nothing hotter, but that which is hottest locally speaking. that source of heat that's accounting for the more and the less, depending on where you are in the house. And for me, when I was studying the fourth way, that image helped me understand what Aquinas, it seems, is getting at when he's trying to argue the more and the less implies necessarily the maximum. And I think that move bypasses or gets around the contemporary objections from Dawkins, et cetera, that the more and the less, well, we find more and less stickiness or stinkiness, right? And so,
right. So
there's
what about the
maximum?
Yeah. What about the
maximum?
The maximum smeller, right? Yeah.
That's right. And this reading from Aquinas's example would fit. Like when I walk into my kitchen, sometimes we walk in the door into the house, it stinks. And then we go down the corridor, the hallway, it stinks more. And then we go into the kitchen and we find the source of the smell. It's the trash. And my 15-year-old needs to take it out, right? And so, Gavin, I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And if that's what's going on in Aquinas's mind when he's saying the more and the less implies the maximum.
Yeah, so I mean, what that describes is really just the metaphysics of per se ordered series. That you have some sort of derived causal feature which the members of the series wouldn't have unless for some primary cause which had it per se. So fire is typically used as an example of a primary cause in per se causal series. The fire heats the pot to heat the contents of the pot. The pot and the contents wouldn't have the actuality of heat unless they participated in the heat of the fire. And so with regard to the fourth way, the pot and the contents of the pot only have the heat to a certain degree. The contents of the pot has the heat literally to a certain degree. The pot itself has the heat to a greater degree. The fire has it in and of itself in virtue of what it is. So you have degrees of heat, let's say. So the example of walking into the house, the fire in the fireplace heats the atmosphere, which heats the person in the atmosphere. And then that can come in degrees depending on how close you are to the fire, which is the primary cause of heat in this situation. Right. And Dawkins is right. If you have, something which is smelly, there will be some sort of, maximal source of smelling. Maximal understood in the sense that it's the origin of the smell.
Amen.
So it could be the rose, it could be the rotting food, it could be the bleach or whatever. It's something from which the odor arises, and then that permeates the air, and the atmosphere participates in it. So Dawkins is right, although he's not right in the way that he wants to be, because his example actually vindicates Aquinas' position here.
I think the key word there was origin. Right. Yeah. So the maximum in Aquinas' mind is the origin or the source of our experience of the more or less of the feature under consideration, goodness, truth, nobility, etc.
Right. And that ties in neatly to the second part of the fourth way, because if what is maximal is per se and thus originates the actuality in question, well, we've got a cause. It's the cause of that. That gradated feature.
Right.
Okay.
So that connects really well.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to highlight that connects really well. That once we, actually, I don't have any more of that in that. So you go ahead, Carlo.
Okay. So moving to the second part, Aquinas arrives at a maximal being, right? Yeah. In light of efficient causality, which we got on the path of, beginning with gradations of goodness, truth, nobility, actuality. Okay. Yeah. Now, in the second part, Aquinas is saying that maximal being, that being that has the feature in virtue of its own essence in a maximal degree, unbounded, unrestricted, is the cause of all things other than itself that have that feature in more or less degrees. Okay. Yeah. So here's my question. We know that the maximal being is going to be the source of the origin or the cause of the more or less feature that we find in a single line of causality. But how do we get from it being the cause of that single line of causality, like the greater degree of goodness that I have versus the plant, to all things that are in degrees of goodness? Like it seems as if he's assuming that the maximal being is only one, and thus the universal cause, without teasing it out.
Yeah. So at the end of the first half of the fourth way, he says we have something which is maximal in being. Maxime ends. So it's maximal in being. It's not just maximal in goodness, truth, or whatever. It's maximal in being. And the only way he can affirm that is if he's thinking about actuality when he has goodness, truth, and nobility in mind. Because something which is maximal in those respects is maximal in being because it's maximal in actuality. And so actuality is at the heart of being because actuality is esse. And so something which is maximal in actuality is maximal in esse, and so maximal in being.
Okay.
So if leading into the second part of the fourth way, we have something which is maximal in being, and that is the cause of everything which has being in a more or less sort of way, in a gradated way, then we have an absolute cause of all that is.
Okay. So there's, do you think that there is a need to show, because note, like, for example, in the first and the second way, here, this is what we all call God. There's at least one uncaused cause, right? That accounts for the line of causality that we started with, or at least one unmoved mover that accounts for the line of causality or line of motion that we started with, maybe the stick moving the stone. But it seems to me like in order to get to an unmoved mover, an uncaused cause, a maximal being that accounts for all, right? You have to first show that there's only one in order to derive universal causality. So I'm wondering if in order for Aquinas to account for all things having their being, their esse, from this maximal being, that he's assuming that the maximal being can only be one, and thus consequently the cause of everything that has esse outside of itself.
I think the unity of the maximal being is an implication of the demonstration. I don't think it's presupposed for the demonstration, because the conclusion in each of the ways is that this primary cause, so the unmoved mover, the primary efficient cause, the absolutely necessary cause, is the source of all that is. Because if we interpret it in terms of metaphysics and see that it's the metaphysics of esse, the dependent status of esse, which is at stake here, and the primary cause is the primary cause of esse for all things, then it's the primary cause without which there is nothing. So anything other than it is an effect of it. There is nothing other than it which is not caused by it. So the unity of that cause then is an implication of that. It's inferred from that. If there is nothing other than it which is not caused by it, then there could be not, it's utterly unique. There could be nothing that is like it because everything else is a creature and thus caused by it.
So it's not a matter of simply being the cause of the esse that's found in gradation between the rose in the garden and me, but just gradated or limited esse generally speaking. Wherever you find limited esse, graded esse, or graded actuality, that maximal being accounts for that, because that's what we arrived at in the first part of it.
So it's not looking at the difference between you and a duck, right? Necessarily. Yeah.
I mean, that could be a starting point, but the metaphysical analysis is just limited esse, generally speaking. That requires a maximal being that has esse in virtue of its own essence.
At least
I would read. Which to me makes that seems like that makes it a stronger parallel to contemporary arguments from limits, and I love those arguments. Right? I think those are strong arguments.
Right. Yep.
Sweet. That's this is good stuff, guys. Really appreciate it. So I do have a date planned with my wife tonight. I still got some time. I'm sure she wouldn't mind if we were a little late because I was talking Thomism and metaphysics. But
are we running date night? Are we? Right.
Yeah, we got the grandparents watching the kids tonight, so we were gonna sneak out a little bit. But Gavin? We did a whole episode on the fifth way before, I'm pretty sure, but I think we should still take the time to cover it just to round out our conversation. So if you guys are ready, why don't we dive right in?
So given what we've seen, the fifth way will be straightforward enough. What Thomas observes, the fifth way is taken from the governance of things, so from finality. Finality is the key feature here. The idea is that things act in a determined way. Whenever things act, they are doing something. If an acting thing is doing nothing, well, it's not acting. So the activity of anything is some sort of determined activity. It's doing something, and that's its finality, the what it's doing. Okay, so the finality of the thing is a particular activity that the thing is doing. That happens to natural things. Well, that happens to unconscious things as much as it happens to conscious things. So, I mean, you could get up after this and go to meet your wife just unthinkingly. And if somebody stopped you and says, "What are you doing?" You says, "Well, I'm going to meet my wife." A fire just heats. And what is a fire doing? Well, it's heating. That's its determined activity. If it feels in that determined activity, it feels as fire, because that's just one of the things that fire does. So if it feels the heat, it's because it's being put out, or the coolness of the atmosphere causes the fire to diminish, and ultimately, it goes out as a fire. So if something feels to act in a determined way as the kind of thing that it is, it's feeling as that kind of thing. So that's the idea of the starting point of the fifth way. And we see this happening in nature all the time, that things act in a determined way, so that they have finality, they act with purpose. So Aquinas observes this finality or a purpose in things, and he reasons then that insofar as things have this finality, but they don't have it essentially, there has to be some primary source for the finality of all things, and this primary source is God. That's just a bit of a précis of the fifth way. Obviously, a lot to unpack in that. So,
but before we get to God, doesn't he reason that the finality in unintelligent natural things requires an intelligence, and then reasoning to a supreme intelligence that governs the finality of all things outside of itself?
Yeah, that's part of the unpacking of the argument. My own gloss on the fifth way is that the intelligence business, the stuff about intelligence, the argument can be run without it. He includes the stuff on intelligence, I just think, for strategic purposes, just given his context.
Which has been that's been somewhat unfortunate in a modern context, because everyone associates it with intelligent design arguments. Now, I don't want to bash intelligent design, because Dr. Michael Behe's a friend of mine. I actually think that they deserve a lot more attention than they get. But it's important to, I think, point out that this is a very different type of argument, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, when you tease out the details of the fifth way, yes, intelligence comes in. The finality of non-intelligent things requires an intelligent thing. And so we have a primary intelligent thing, which causes the finality of everything else. So I think that's part of the details of the fifth way, in the same way that, say, the analysis of motion is part of the first way, possibly in necessity in the third way. But I think what's really going on is locating some sort of primary source for finality in the fifth way.
Cool. Yeah. So Carlo?
Yeah. So I think the key principle that many will ask about, Aquinas says, now whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, so that directed activity, it cannot have the directed activity toward a specific end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence. So why is it that such directed activity requires intelligence?
Yeah. So the idea there is that the finality of things without intelligence is a participated or dependent finality. They don't have that finality in and of themselves. So if you think, so we take the traditional example of the per se series. The mind moves the hand to move the stick to move the stone. So there's a determined activity there, and there's a determined activity of the mental agent. He's determined to do something. What's determining his activity? Well, why does he move his hands to move the stick to move the stone? Just interchange it with the golf example. Why does the golf player move his hands to swing the club to hit the ball? There's some sort of goal which he is trying to obtain. Let's say he wants to just improve or something like that, or he wants to win at the sport or something. So there's some sort of end which the golf player sees, and he induces that finality to the hand, stick, and stone. The idea throughout is that the finality is a participated finality. It's not a finality that the thing has per se, and that's how the argument runs.
Right. Yeah. So we would be stuck in that sort of infinite causal regress where nothing even gets started, right? Unless we have that primary, final cause of all causes in this sense.
Well,
right?
on my reading of the fifth way, the participated finality would be left unexplained unless there were some sort of primary cause of finality, without which there wouldn't be any finality in question. And that primary cause of finality has to be something intelligent.
Okay, so what is the indicator that the acorn, for example, doesn't have its finality, its directed activity to produce an oak tree rather than a banana tree? What is the indicator that such finality is not had per se in virtue of itself?
Okay, so
or in virtue of its essence?
So what's the finality, the determined activity of an acorn then? It's just to be and then to grow into the oak tree given the right conditions surrounding it. So that finality is derived from its form, the kind of thing that it has. And the acorn doesn't have the form per se. The acorn's essence just is its form, but it doesn't have its form in itself. It obtains its form because it's caused in its being.
So that the acorn comes into existence, right? And it's
that a thing of that kind comes into being.
Correct. And that would be the indication that it doesn't have its directed activity of itself in an absolute way, because it's receiving its very existence and essence from something else.
Right. So
its form of existence is derived and dependent. Yeah,
that's a nice way of reading this. It's a nice support to some other ways that it's interpreted too, because certain other thinkers, again, won't mention their names unless they're here to defend themselves, would say that it just becomes unintelligible, and they kind of leave it at that, right? It becomes unintelligible that an acorn always becomes, an oak tree, or that, especially since it's presumably unconscious. Who knows? Maybe there's an interior subjective life to an acorn that we can't have access to. But most of us think it's kind of just a dumb brute thing, or why an electron is attracted to protons, right? It becomes unintelligible, and there's kind of a sense where the oak tree is almost the cause of the acorn, right? And it would become unintelligible unless you had a mind that could relate these concepts, right? And give existence to these forms. But once you kind of that I think that's fine as far as it goes. We don't want things to be unintelligible. There's a very high price tag to that, as we've seen epistemologically. But once you even go further with the metaphysics and you get back to the essence and existence distinction, we have we just have the classic, Aquinas path there as well, right?
So because the finality of things comes from them, or is in them in virtue of the fact that they have a certain form, and they don't have a form just necessarily. They're dependent for their forms because they're dependent as, particular kinds of beings. Then whatever causes them as beings, that from which they derive their being, must primordially contain the forms of all these things. But if it primordially contains the forms, i.e. if it's pure existence itself, which has all the forms of anything which possibly could be, but isn't any one of those forms, then it has those forms intentionally or in a mind.
Right.
Yeah, that's a cool way of reading it. I must say that's new for me.
Gavin's got all sorts of little surprises.
Yeah, so it's sort of the line that we take for why is God intelligent, right? So when we try to answer that question, we normally take the path of saying, well, he's the cause of all of these things, right? And so if he's the cause, he must have the forms of those things in a primordial way, as you said, right? Not that he becomes those things, but that he has them in order to give them being. And since you have forms existing in an immaterial way, then you have intelligence. And so it seems to be what you're saying is reading the fifth way in that way of going from this directed activity to intelligence. That middle step is directed activity, which comes by way of the form. And since this thing with its form is coming from something, right? A cause is giving it being. That cause is going to have the form in a primordial way, and thus you have an intelligent being.
Yeah. I also think what's important here as well is that in order to have finality, you have to have some sort of magnetic attraction towards a goal. So the cause which gives the being and thus the form to the thing also functions as that sort of magnetic attraction to which the forms or the being of all things gravitate towards. So it has to be, and that's the good, okay? Because the goal of any causal process is the completion of the thing. The completion is the perfection, which is the good. So that which draws all things to itself is the good itself. So that which gives the forms to things has to be the good by which those forms reach their completion, because the forms are contained primordially in the source.
So you're arriving at not only a first efficient cause, but a first final cause.
An ultimate final cause. Right. I think the per se series reasoning runs in exactly the same way, only we have ultimate or primary final cause as opposed to primary efficient cause. I think the two coincide in the source of being.
Right.
So I mean, just to show that philosophy can at least be a little practical, right? Okay, so, you know, from the other arguments, we've showed that the whole reason we exist is because of God. Would it be fair, Gavin, do you think from this argument you can say the whole reason that we exist is also for God?
Yeah,
toward God?
The whole reason for which we exist is God as well. In other words, God is the primary final cause of all things. He is the good to which all things strive and are drawn to, like a magnet. If God is the good, then any action of his as efficient cause is in light of the good which he is. So in the same way that, you know, the golf player, you know, moves his hands to move the club, to move the ball, is attracted to some sort of good he wants to attain, God is also attracted to some sort of good that he wants to attain in creating things, and that's the divine essence itself. So God's motivation for creating everything is that everything he creates will manifest his goodness and ultimately enjoy his goodness. For certain creatures, that could just be to exist and enjoy certain goods of creation. Ultimately, for rational creatures, that's to know and to love God and to enter into communion with God. So I think, you know, when we get to the fifth way, we get to the very heart of Aquinas' views on creation, and all of creation, and ultimately human beings are ordained to coming to know and love God and be united with him.
So, Gavin, at the end of the fifth way, when Aquinas concludes, therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end. Yeah. You read that direction to the end as being ultimately the final cause, rather than reading simply an intelligent being an efficient cause that's directing in the sense of imparting the finality. Exactly. So your reading is an intelligent being that exists that is not only directing by imparting, but directing by drawing things to itself.
Yeah, precisely. So, God isn't directing things in the way that, you know, kids do on Minecraft or something like that. That's not what he's doing. Rather, what God does is he brings certain things into existence which have a form, and insofar as they have a form, they have a determined activity. But all determined activity is completed in the good itself, which God is. And so God is the primary final cause towards which everything is directed, or to which everything is drawn. Yeah.
Okay. So what would you say to someone, and this is just purely, you know, a reading of Thomas, and even just application to evangelizing or talking to an atheist, right? And trying to show that God exists.
Yeah.
Would it be sufficient to simply stop with the supreme intelligence being an efficient cause that imparts being to forms that have the directed activity to some end that the first efficient supreme intelligence bestows upon it, and that supreme intelligence that is directing the activity of that thing would have its directing activity in virtue of its essence and therefore be pure essay, because If you're going to have undirected activity, you're going to have uncaused essay. And then that's God. And that the final cause aspect of directing the thing's activity ultimately to itself would be an added bonus, but that stopping with efficient causality would be sufficient for proving God exists. What do you think of that?
Strategically speaking, I mean, I think, if you were just to give that a kind of, philosophical argument presentation, that could work. Okay. Strategically speaking, you might get hit with very, sort of tricky questions as to, for what sake is this primary cause directing the activity of things? Right. What's the point? What's the goal here? Even philosophically speaking, if you were to run that argument, you would have to say something of, to the effect that, it's directing the activity of these things, and this is what it is directing the activity for. Mm-hmm. And even at the start of the fifth way, Thomas says something to that effect, that, things act for an end because, they act for the good. Ultimately, all creatures act for the good of the universe. Mm-hmm. Words to that effect. So there is that for the sake of which things act whenever one considers their determined activity. And so one would query then, if you just stop it at the efficient cause determining the activity of things, one would query, well, what is that for the sake of which the efficient cause is determining that activity?
Right. Now, I suppose one could say that the efficient cause is determining the activity of the acorn for the perfection of the acorn, right? But then that raises the question, well, what is the perfection of the acorn for, right? Mm-hmm. And so this where it gets to the manifestation of God's goodness, or the efficient cause goodness, and drawing all things to itself and manifesting its glory.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, somebody might even question, well, if, the primary efficient cause is determining the activity of the acorn for its perfection as an oak tree, somebody might just say, well, why is it determining it for perfection? Why can't it determine it for imperfection?
Right.
So why? So I think one would need to build in there, if you have determining activity for perfection, that's because this primary efficient cause is the good itself, and it wants to see things completed and reach their goals, which is their perfection.
Which is a manifestation of its own goodness.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're going to get hit with, well, why doesn't it, determine it for imperfection? Why isn't it like Morgoth and Lord of the Rings, trying to mess everything up?
Right. Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff.
It's interesting that you present the fifth way in that way, because in reading the literature, I've come across a few authors who read the fifth way as final causality, right? And ending in final causality. Dennis Bonet, in conversations with him, I know he's always quipped, whether it's efficient causality or final causality, right? And kind of like on the fence about it, like you can read it either way. But I think you do make a good point about finalizing it, pun intended, with final causality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of these discussions within Thomism kind of, they really get hung up on, well, is it efficient or final, or in the fourth way, is it exemplar or efficient? Right. And to my mind, that's a bit of a hangover from the manualist days of Thomism. We had to get everything univocally correct and straight as to what Aquinas was saying. Aquinas was a very sort of analogical thinker. He's kind of he's thinking of causality, all right, but the causality that he's thinking of at this part of the argument is, well, actuality, which is manifested in this way. But then at this part of the argument, the actuality is being manifested in this way. But the point is that we have the manifestation or the causality of actuality, which is ultimately dependent on some source of actuality, which can be conceived as efficient or final, just so long as you give the proper qualifications. So I tend to kind of resist those univocalizing treatments of something, an issue like causality in the proofs, precisely because I want to get behind the notion of what causality actually is and what's at stake in causality, and then label it whatever way you want, realizing that the labels are just latching on to some sort of metaphysical reality, which is there anyway. So
Yeah, I agree. I agree 100% that, the efficient cause is going to entail the final cause because it's only going to act for a final cause, right?
Yeah.
So you definitely have both there. How would you articulate, I know we probably have to wrap it up here, Pat. So just real quick, Gavin, how would you articulate at the end where he says the intelligent being exists by whom all, so there's the emphasis of the all again, all natural things. Because if we start, say, with the acorn, and we arrive at this supreme intelligence that's directing the activity of the acorn to itself to manifest its own goodness for its own goodness sake, right? How do you get from that single line of causality to the supreme intelligence directing the activity of all unintelligent natural things, and even, of course, finite intelligent things that are acting for some end?
So it's the per se causal series reasoning. If the causality in question is the causality of finality, the causality of the good, and we have a primary source of finality, a primary source of the good, which is per se good, which is goodness itself, well then anything other than that which has finality is caused to be in its finality by that.
So it's once again, that which has it per se is going to be the cause of all things that have the feature non per se, in an accidental way.
Yeah, everything other than it. Yeah.
Right.
So it's the same argument for uniqueness, just run the other way around from the efficient cause argument.
Yeah.
We did it, guys. We got, we got through the 5 ways. Now, I hate to have to do this, but I think I have to ask both of you be willing to return to a round 3 where we could field some questions and maybe unpack the divine attributes.
Oh, yeah, of course. Always happy. Yeah.
I'm totally game for that, brother.
Because I do have questions, and I promise people we would get the questions out, but unfortunately I do have to jet, so I can't do it today. But if you guys are good for it, we will, and all the listeners, we can have round 3. So then if you have questions and you're listening, or objections that we didn't, and we did cover a lot of objections as we worked our way through. I think we covered some of the ones that we would all consider probably the best, strongest objections, like the brute fact objection. So they were weaved into our conversation as well. But if you have questions, things, points you would like articulated, email me. PatFlynn@chroniclesofstrength.com is the best way. Just put podcast in the subject line. So that way I know how to find it. And then we'll do on the next conversation, we'll figure out scheduling offline, guys. We'll take your questions, address any objections we feel need to be addressed that we didn't in this one. And then we'll try to unload some of the divine attributes as well. Does that sound good with you guys?
Sounds good to me, man.
Yeah.
Before we go, we got to get you guys your plugs. So Carlo first, then Gavin. Carlo, give us the rundown of who you are, what you're doing, where people can get in touch, follow your work, and then.
Yeah, I am a full-time apologist and speaker for Catholic Cancers down in San Diego. And they can follow my work at Catholic.com and everything that we do as an organization at Catholic Cancers at Catholic.com. And all of my work, my videos, audio, and articles are sort of located in one spot at CarloBroussard.com. So that's awesome. Me.
Gavin, the quick rundown of all your work, please, if you don't mind.
So yeah, I lecture in philosophy at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, Ireland, County Kildare. I've written a few books. Just check them out on Amazon if you're interested. There's Pat's holding up one of them. Or just Google me and you'll see, sort of my books, my publications. If you go on the St. Patrick's College Maynooth website, you'll see my staff page. You'll see various details about me. You'll see my contact details. Add me on Facebook, get in touch. We can be in contact. Anybody is thinking of doing doctoral work in philosophy and would be interested in working with me, get in touch. We have a nice doctoral program with a nice grant. Also, we have a big conference coming up next year. A lot of big names in the sort of, Christian philosophy within the Christian tradition world, including John Canassis. So I'll get to have a chat with him, Eleanor Stump, David Bentley Hart, Rowan Williams, people like that. They're all going to be there. And that'll be in sort of April, May time next year. So you're all very welcome. Come, hang out, it'll be cool. We'll have crack, all the rest.
Yeah, I'll be there too. So, and with my whole family in tow. So it'll be an interesting Irish vacation for us. We're really looking forward to it. So I will link all your stuff, Carlo, everything you mentioned, Gavin, in the show notes. Guys, thanks again. This has just been such a blast, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thank you, Pat.
Okay. Thank you, Pat.